Hello and welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast. I'm Adam Huss, coming to you from Los Angeles, California. Thank you so much for listening. This is the second part of the special in-person on-site conversation that I had in June of 2023, just a few weeks ago as I write this, with Mike Biltonen of Know Your Roots. Please check out part 1 for Mike's full bio and for a fantastic episode about holistic orchard culture within a biodynamic context. On this episode, we leave Mike's Apostrophe orchard and enter the forest that surrounds it. We leave the realm of the known, the controlled, the cultivated, and enter the realm of questions, of curiosity, of the unexplored. The pace changes, the energy shifts, and the conversation evolves. I invite you to take this walk with us, but the suggestion I make is this. Don't enter the forest. Become it. The forest is the source of the orchard, the source of the vines in the vineyard. It is also our source. Our bodies and lives, our cultures, grow out of nature, out of the wild. When I speak of developing a more ecological wine culture, I'm essentially talking about ecomimicry, biomimicry, or just emulating the forest ecosystem more closely with our cultures. Along this walk, we discover amazing wild vines and talk of wine forests and vitiforestry. We speak of the need for further research into plant communication and energetics. We observe the values that the forest manifests in its multiple, diverse, and interconnected forms, and how these differ from and could be better incorporated into our production-oriented farming. We ask how to embrace beauty in our viticulture and pomiculture, along with ecological integration and economic viability. At a time when we now see the effect that the industrial food and beverage production system has, not just on what we eat and drink, but on the human psyche and on Gaia, Mike asks us to begin to consider the integration of secular and esoteric science. While he affirms the importance of data and statistics, he asks how we can marry those with our observations of nature that often give us better intuitive insights. Mike suggests that the more time we spend in nature, on our farms, in our vineyards and orchards, without the intentions of productivity and economic extraction, the better our observations become and the better our science becomes. I've recently started reading a book I'm already sure will be added to the reading list at organicwinepodcast.com. It's called The Biology of Wonder by Andreas Weber, or Weber. This bit from his introduction towards a poetic ecology seems to really fit this episode. Within nature, those values and meanings that life processes naturally produce manifest as living, vibrant forms that are therefore observable by the senses. In the bodies of other living beings, existential experiences such as fullness and fear, flourishing and hunger, death and birth, are not hidden but visible. They are manifest in their appearance. They are incarnate in the bodies of other organisms. Nature in this fashion exemplifies what we too are. It is the living medium of our emotions and our mental concepts. The power of the elements, the birth, growth, and vanishing of other beings, the alternation of light and dark that frames our own inner landscape, the inner and outer dimensions of nature, are one. But if the longing for nature is a necessary condition for our being, the vanishing of other creatures will have far-reaching consequences. It is possible that in the global environmental crisis, we are about to destroy something without which we are not able to exist. Whew, can't wait to finish this book. Also, Mike and I have done a fair bit of name-dropping in these 2 episodes, and I want to give shout-outs to some of the great New York producers who informed various ideas and observations and experiences mentioned here. Alfie and Deanna at Dear Native Grapes in the Catskills, Autumn and Ezra at Eve Cidery in Van Etten, Dava and Eric at Redbird Orchard Cider in Trumansburg, and Charlie and Josh of the brand spanking new Sylvan Farm in Hammondsport. Get to know these folks and their ciders and wines. There is a reason we mentioned them. And now, let's become the forest. Enjoy. So my question was, what was my question?
What do I look for in a piece of land to plant an orchard or vineyard?
Yeah.
Well, somewhat fortuitously, I teach a class on this.
Oh, fantastic.
To help people who are looking.
Is that on September 9th?
That is on September 9th,
I'm going to try to be here for that.
Yes. Anyway, so...
you teach many classes, I should say, for the record. Here.
Yes, I do.
And people can get them on knowyourroots.com?
Knowyourroots.com with 1 R.
No, your roots.
No, you roots.
No, you
Yeah.
roots.
Somebody else bought the other domain,
Got
so we
it.
kind of like, you know. But
Got
you'll
it.
know that you aren't at an orchard when you go, if you go to Know Your Roots with 2 R's. So
Got it.
yeah. So basically, you know, you're looking for. I mean, it's like retail. It's location, location, location. Now, sometimes people have to work with what they have to work with, and so you make the best of it. And like I did here, even. I mean, this ground was not the best. I didn't have a full year to really work with it to prepare it for the trees, but it had some elevation to it.
Okay.
It had some slope, so there was good air drainage.
Okay.
It was west facing, so it got good sunlight.
Okay.
It was cleared, and and it was an area that was known for fruit production.
Right.
I mean, I know that there's people who are growing. They have apple orchards in the Catskills and other places that aren't traditional, and grapes as well. So it's not improbable that you can do that. But there's a reason, like there are 3 main regions for apple and grape production in New York State. And it's because the location is very conducive to being successful on a relatively annual basis.
What's the problem with the Catskills?
Cold.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. I mean, now, if you...
Because you don't get the lake effect, you mean? Or
You don't have the lake effect. It can get really cold. And I think even here in the Finger Lakes, a lot of the grape producers here will get winter damage in the, and so you have to be careful about that. But I think then, if you're thinking about it differently, say like Alfie is
right
at Deer Native Grapes, where you're working with different, not just different varieties, with different species that are more conducive to that climate.
Yes.
Then you're talking about, or getting into that ecological adaptation thing that we were talking about earlier. So,
well, yeah, I mean, right, like we were over in the Catskills 2 days ago and definitely saw wild grapes. So I mean, they figured out how to thrive there, and like that, to your point, yeah, I think that's Alfie's point as well, which is like, finding, like, they can do it. Like, we just growing the wrong ones if they're not doing it,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to go, say, plant a vineyard and you were putting in Syrah and Chardonnay and
right.
Zinfandel, it's just like, here, why don't you just write me a check? I'll save you the hassle and, type of thing. But, you work with, the natives that he's working with and some of the hybrids that came out of Minnesota, then I really think that you have a good opportunity to make something like that work. But, the other part is, like, I don't want it to be... You don't want to plant in a frost pocket either.
Right, right.
So, and sometimes you have to work with what you have to, but if you can avoid frost pockets, you're going to have a better chance of success year in and year out.
Again, risk management.
It's a very dry way to look at it, but you have to think about these things because, regardless of your ability to invest and manage that orchard, and your ability to lose or not lose a crop in a given year, I think most people would prefer to be able to produce crops on a regular basis because that's what the economy of their business is, based on.
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah.
There's some wild vine.
Yeah.
Well.
So anyway, let me just.
Yeah, please.
So now we're entering the other part of the property, which I almost find to be more intriguing than the orchard, but you can edit that part out.
No, I think it's important. I know what you mean. Exactly.
Where we're really starting to see what this part of the Finger Lakes is really about from an ecosystem standpoint. I mean, we have, there's hickories, there's honeysuckle, which is everywhere. There's spice bushes in here. I still haven't found those maitakes yet, but they're out there somewhere. But the one thing that I have found through here is like an amazing array of different types of wild grapes.
Yeah.
That really is very exciting. And in large part, listening to many of the other people you've had on your podcast, thought about now how can I do something out here that will allow me to take advantage of that, intervene to grow those vines in a way that I can harvest something.
Yeah.
Because one of the areas that we're going to get to, the vines are 80 feet in the air, you know?
Yeah. No,
you know, and you can't, I mean, you know, it's cool to look at, but I'm not harvesting any grapes from there.
Yeah.
So is there a way to kind of create sort of a natural trellis system in here to, you know, the what was it, the vitiforestry concept?
Yeah.
Or some of the stuff I think that I remember hearing Deidre talk about.
Yeah.
But just set it up so that it's, you know, you've got vines that are growing on a modified sort of natural trellis out here in the woods, and you harvest the grapes.
Yeah. Yeah, it does seem like you'd have to bring the canopy open a bit, right? And then create a forest edge within the forest, sort of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
What I noticed with a couple of the vines that we were walking on our land down in Spencer, and what I noticed, a really cool thing that I noticed was a lot of them started as spirals on the ground. So the vine literally came out and did a full circle, like a 360-degree circle before it started climbing up. And then, of course, yeah, like you said, it was up in the canopy, so we couldn't even see the top of it. But I thought, like, multiple vines did that. It was very cool to see. And so these old, you know, the old thick-barked vine had this beautiful spiral thing that before it started climbing, like it was, like they talk about bees that come out of the hive and they circle a couple times to orient themselves before they go foraging, so like they sort of GPS themselves in relation to the hive.
Right. Well, you know, and that opens up a whole other rabbit hole about plant communication, which is like,
right,
totally has me entranced, because I mean, we can talk scientifically about tropisms and that kind of stuff, but how does a plant really sense where to go? How do the roots really sense where to go?
Yeah.
And there is some level, even though it's not the way we're conscious, you know, those mycorrhizal fungi or the plant roots or the plant itself or the vine that's 360ing on the ground, it's doing something.
Right.
And this is where, you know, we need to really, I think, if we're going to be successful at growing food in the next 100 years, we have to integrate these sciences, these sort of secular sciences and the spiritual sciences, or just the esoteric science.
Yeah. The
power of observation, of really looking at what's going on with whatever's like right around us.
Yeah.
So, but there's an interesting researcher who, she's Italian, but she's at the University of Australia, Monica Gagliano, she has like a whole research lab set up around plant communication. And there's another guy in Florence, Italy, Stefano Mancuso, who's doing like,
she wrote a book. She's fighting for the rights of plants, right? Like she's trying to.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just saw that. I think she did a panel at Raw. Like Isabel had her do a whole talk at one of the Raws, I think in Europe, which is online, which blew my mind in a good way. You know, I mean, it wasn't like new to me, but it was sort of like took it to the next level. And
right.
I was like, oh yeah, this is a whole other can of worms to think about.
Yeah. Well, again, it's that sort of expansive thinking of, you know, bring us as individuals into a different realm of thinking about what agriculture is really about.
Right.
You know, and I mean, how
important we are.
And how important we are. Yeah. You know, because I think the coalescence of all knowledge, our knowledge, plant knowledge, mycorrhizal knowledge, etc., is the sum is greater than the individual parts, and it helps us, I think, address some issues that are, you know, not really being addressed the way that they should be.
No.
I mean, if we're still talking about just like the value of composts and plant teas and, you know, how dangerous synthetic, I mean, we're not even talking about how dangerous synthetic pesticides are. I mean, we are.
Right.
But, you know, out in the world, I mean, Roundup's still the number one sprayed used pesticide on the planet.
Yeah.
You know, the U.S. EPA couldn't get their head out of their ass to, well, in large part it was because of Trump, but to ban lorsban or chlorpyrifos until just a couple of years ago, and it's like such a widely known neurotoxin.
Right.
And there's like numerous examples after that, but it's just like, we can't get out of our own way sometime and think differently. And a lot of it, I think, is fear-based. So I talked about risk management.
Yeah.
I think, overcoming our fears of thinking differently and doing different things is another tool that we need to be able to do. We need to break out of our comfort zone.
Yeah. I think I want to make a correction to what I said. I said I sort of alluded to we overemphasize our importance, and I don't think that's it. I think we are important. We're just not special. Like everything is important.
Right.
We shouldn't think of ourselves as especially more important than anything else.
Right.
Yeah. Equally important and with a lot of power because of our brains.
Yeah. Well, and we have historically over the last how many ever thousands of years placed the human species on a pedestal that it doesn't belong on.
Yeah.
And this is where I think, there's an old Earth First saying, nature bats last. It's like, we're not going to be able to outrun nature. No matter what we do to the environment, nature's going to bat last.
Yeah.
And it's going to have that bottom of the ninth, single that drives in the winning run for itself, if nothing else. Now, I am looking for...
I was going to ask, where are we?
Yeah, well, we're in the middle of the woods, if you hadn't figured that out. So the edge of the property comes right up to this ravine over here, this gorge.
And that is a gorge for sure. Wow.
Yes, watch your step.
Wow.
But I'm still learning where everything is, and I don't have my internal GPS totally dialed in.
Well, I'm also making you talk while you walk and think about other things other than pay attention necessarily.
Yeah, and that's so. But sprinkled throughout here, there's a lot of wild grapes, and
I see across the way there, a big gnarly thing.
That's where I'm headed. Yeah.
I'm so glad we're doing this. This is what I did all day yesterday. Hey, here's something. Little something.
Oh yeah, that just popped up.
Yeah, I was going to say that earlier. I noticed the woods seemed to be pretty. It was a pretty dry spring, so there's not a lot of mushroom activity that I've seen, even with this new rain that came.
Yeah, not recently, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean we're starting to get more rain, so I'm heading out to check on things a bit more frequently than I did when we were in the middle of the drought in May.
Yeah. Well, and I'll go back to what you said about you're almost more excited about this part of the property than the orchard. And I mean, so much of what I want to do with vines and trees is to recreate this in an ecosystem that is obviously much more human in scale so that we can harvest it, but that essentially tries to replicate this feeling that you get of being within a different realm. Instead of, I think like vineyards feel like rows of fences that exclude you, really, and aren't interactive and are, the intention behind them is efficiency, productivity, those are the main things,
right.
like commercial extraction for the most part, rather than things like the sense that you get when you're in a forest, which is the sense of wonder, the sense of, peace, a sense of like interactive, of being, sort of, within a system rather than on top of it or excluded from a system, or, the system existing for as this separate thing from you intended for financial gain. This is like this has a whole different intention behind it, and replicating that with a vineyard and orchard is kind of my goal, to do like a wine forest,
Right.
rather than a vineyard. And the thing that I was saying, where you had planted those the wildflowers, the perennial wildflowers. The question I have for you is, like, how hard would it be, or from your experience, to maintain commercial, or like what's the word I'm looking for, profitability, while implementing beauty into a system? Like, have you considered that, or what are your thoughts?
Well,
on
I've
that?
considered that probably longer than I've considered most of the things we've been talking about.
Awesome. Awesome.
You know, and it really comes down to, you know, triple bottom line accounting, is that we don't take things like aesthetics and clean water and clean air and healthy soil, healthy food into account of the economics. Yeah, organic food's more expensive than conventional, yada, 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 but we really don't have that third line of quote unquote revenue, of benefit or value added, or, you know, whatever you want to call it, that where we can take those things into account. And for me, it's, I mean, I guess to a large degree, it's a seventh generation approach. It's like, I want to leave the land better than when I found it for the next 7 generations. And yeah, I do want it to be economically beneficial. And I've, you know, as I said, I'm looking to try and use all of this, the orchard, you know, the nut orchard that I have over there that's just getting started, you know, for research and education to help people better understand how they can do the same thing, you know, from an aesthetic standpoint, from an ecological standpoint, from an economic standpoint. So, you know, and there are people who have attempted to put values on those kinds of things. I was part of a research paper when I was at Cornell in the early 90s with a iconic ecological professor, Dave Pimentel. And it was basically trying to, in a very robust way, understand the economic impacts of pesticide use globally, taking into account all these things that we don't take into account. Now, this was less about bringing aesthetics into it, but it was like all the expenses that come along with pesticide use to human health, or soil degradation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Water,
and it was still
air.
an amazing piece of work, even though you were accumulating a lot of literature from around the world.
Yeah.
But it was published in several books and chapters, and it was a paper by itself, et cetera. But what it really told me is, like, we're not looking at this thing in any other way except for in a very extractive way of, like, how can I make the most money from growing these grapes and turning them into wine,
Yeah.
and getting people to buy it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, speaking of how old is this part of the forest, do you think? Like, when was it last logged, do you think?
Well, it's hard to say. It was obviously logged at some point, but
Yeah.
it's probably been 100 years, I would guess.
I was going to say, I wouldn't be
Yeah.
surprised if this vine is 100 years old.
Well, that was my guess, yeah.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, when I came up upon it, I was just like, holy crap.
Yeah, most of the vines that I was looking at yesterday were a single trunk structure spiraling around up into the trees where it finally branched. This is like monstrous jungle gym of spiraling trunks.
Yeah.
Straight from the ground. The one is, holy crap, I mean, at least 6 inches in diameter. In some parts bigger than that for sure. At the base, it's probably a foot or
Yeah,
more.
at least a foot, yeah. You know, then it's sending off new shoots, and you could use it to train up its own. The vine's
Yeah.
already going to the top, and yeah, I'm not going to climb 40 feet into the air, but I'll go 15 feet to harvest any grapes that might come off of that.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I think one of the big things, which kind of brings us back more to the secular science, is, like, is it going to get enough sunlight
Right.
to actually survive? And that's why these vines have gone all the way to the top, because
Yeah,
they're harvesting sunlight.
Yeah, and I've said this before, I mean, not to you, but, you know, one of the magical things to me about vines is their ability to sort of survive at any level in the canopy. They can crawl along the ground, they can be on a little shrub or an apple, you know, like pond side, or they can climb all the way to the top of a 100-foot canopy and be up, you know, and get what they need to survive, even
Yeah.
within, like, a full mature forest.
So there's that one that's just, it looks like
Oh,
a Tarzan
straight
vine,
up.
you
Wow.
know? And, I mean, don't ask me how it got there. It was probably on
Right,
that on
right.
that tree that fell eventually.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
But you know, there's one tree, and I will be hard pressed to absolutely find. But you can look around. I mean, there's that. I mean, that's an impressive vine.
I think that one comes from this one.
Well, I'm sure. I think they probably all do, and that's where I started thinking
the layering and
the layering of it. But looking on the ground for where, some of those suckers are coming up and being able to use it, and maybe taking snags like this and putting them at an angle, and then allowing that vine to grow up it.
Yeah.
In its own way, at its own pace.
Yeah.
But giving it a little more utility to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
And you can see over here where there's, it looks like the little sun is coming through. There might be a new shoot coming up right there. From one of the old, and I mean, I love the idea of, like, especially if you have a 100-year-old vine like that, if it had 100 years to just, like, try to figure out an entire acre of land, and then you have the superorganism, like, it's sending up shoots from, everywhere, where it's putting down roots and sending up shoots and putting down roots and sending up shoots, and then this ecosystem grows in, and you have what looks like a whole vineyard orchard or vineyard forest, but it's one vine, it's one ecosystem, it's one, one organism, and all connected as
and
you
then
walk through.
And then how are the hemlocks and the oaks and the maples and the other trees, how are they changing, from an epigenetic standpoint, the character of that grape? I mean, we don't know what variety that is. I mean, if it's 100 years old, it could be nothing, or it could be something that's but because hemlocks and maples and oaks are not normal parts of a normal vineyard setup,
right?
What
we consider normal now,
what we consider to be normal,
yeah.
But just bringing it into a different ecosystem, different plant associations.
Yeah. No, this is the other idea I have, is like every row in my wine forest will be a different species of tree, and see, I mean, you could plant all the same grape and just see if each row tastes different, kind of thing, like, I don't know, but I just, I've heard that they do well with certain species like maple and, what's the other one? Maple's been really traditional, but then the mulberries are apparently really, they really grow crazy with mulberries for some reason. But yeah, these are the questions I'm asking too. Like, what's it like? It's such a fun, unexplored thing in modern times. I'm sure, the ancients had answers to some of these questions because this is the environment that they found the grapes in and worked with them, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, it's like, and I haven't been there. This is Anna. I've heard this from other people, but we know that it's in Spain, the cider industry is such that each village had apple trees that it would harvest from, and each village had kind of their own terroir, their own cider they produced. And when you went from town to town to town, there may be a similar style in terms of how they made it in that very sort of Spanish way, but each cider was different too, because the trees that they nurtured over the years and the climate and the people who were making it were different than the next town over.
Right.
And
I dig that.
So
that is a gorgeous vine. Thanks for showing that.
Yeah.
It's amazing. So you have a crew of people, it sounds like, is that right?
I have 2 employees that work with me, yeah.
Oh, okay. And how much, like how many acres do you consult on and manage?
Well, and this is a whole bed of sassafras. So,
oh, wow.
So if you want to
make some root beer,
here it is. So this is another like really interesting find. So, yeah, I've got approximately a dozen growers that I work with, very hands-on.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you don't have to give specific anything.
And I'm just, all told, it probably is, like 500 or 600 acres.
Yeah.
None of the orchards are like incredibly large, but, there's two that are, 100 acres plus, a few that are kind of in the 50 range, and then some that are smaller than that. And then I do some remote consulting as well.
Uh-huh.
So I have clients where we'll meet or call on a weekly basis and kind of talk about what they're seeing and discuss what they need to do.
Have you had any experiences with clients where you've brought them further down the path than they thought they would ever go in terms of the kind of farming that you do and recommend?
I think so. I do work with some growers that still spray conventionally.
Uh-huh.
But the idea is to transition them. And this is like one of the other like realistic things is you can't, particularly for an orchard or farm that's been managed conventionally for years, you can't just walk in and like flip the switch.
Right.
And I've kind of placed a time frame of 4 to 7 years of transitional time before you can like be really in that organic, biodynamic, holistic realm.
Yeah.
And so I work with everybody to lighten the load on their spray programs, to work with as many biological and holistic products as they can, to think nutritionally beyond your typical NP and K additions, to work with compost and wood chips and biological sprays. So, and we're still kind of, we're still in that time frame with a few of them.
Right.
There's also other, logistical issues that are involved. But and then there's some others that we're already in it to win it.
Yeah.
And those are the ones that either had been managed biodynamically for a while or organically, or new orchards which were just recently established, or some growers that just had like a hardcore, we're just doing it and we're going to see what happens.
Have any of the conventional ones, have they started to see a difference, or as you've worked with them, have they, I don't know, I'm just curious if you had any stories about them, tentatively trying something and then being surprised or anything like that.
Oh yeah. That's part of the reason that we really kind of had to hit the reset button. Is like there were a couple growers I worked with where we leapt right into it with an organic program, and by mid-July everything looked gorgeous.
Yeah.
And I thought, man, we are geniuses here. And then by the end of July, beginning of August, the wheels came off the train, and we really had to, just to salvage whatever crop there was in the trees, we had to hit the reset button and just go back to doing what we had to do. I mean, yeah. And it was sad to have to do that, but it taught me a lot about how patience is like a big part of that transitional thing, that no matter how hard you want to do it, you have to be realistic with what the hurdles are going to be. And you have to look at the history of the farm, how it was managed, how it is being managed. Yeah. The varieties are there, because there's some varieties which are just, they don't belong in an organic setting unless it's in California or Washington or wherever.
Yeah.
We just have too much disease pressure on the East Coast.
Yeah.
And then there's others which are like, man, if I could plant 100 acres of this and I could do nothing, and I look like a genius. And that's what's so exciting about what I have going on here is like, this is what I want people to see, that, incorporating these plant teas and taking a very bio approach and working with the plant biodiversity, working with the soil health in a very coherent way. I mean, the trees look great, and the only reason we don't have a crop this year, it's not because the trees don't look good, it's because of the stupid freeze.
Right.
And that's what I'd like to do, is to get more growers to be able to implement some of that stuff, either in some trial blocks or on an orchard-wide setting. Because there are biological realities, and it is what it is.
Yeah.
And this is, again, genetics comes in important. I think things like Gala and Fuji and Honeycrisp are kind of ridiculous to try and grow in organic settings. But there are...
In my backyard, they seem to do fine.
Well, yeah, but...
I'm not even spraying them with anything.
Yeah.
They're thriving.
Yeah. Well...
Fuji, anyway.
Yeah. Your backyard in
Los Angeles.
Right, I was going to say, yeah. A slightly different climate.
Yes,
there. Yeah. And I think that you have to realize geographically what works well. And this goes back to another part of looking at some of these, locally or regionally adapted wild or feral varieties and seeing how we can bring them into, production.
Yeah.
But I do know that some people who've done that is like, once you take that tree, cuttings from that mother tree, graft it, grow another tree, and plant it in a different location, it acts differently. And that goes to this whole, okay, so what is this environment doing with that 100-year-old grapevine that probably wouldn't happen if we were to root that graft or root that vine and plant it in a more traditional, vineyard setting.
Wow. Yeah.
But it's a pretty peaceful place back here.
That's lovely down there.
Yeah, this keeps running.
Is that all on the property?
Yeah.
It goes over to the other side?
The property line's actually the middle of the creek.
Oh, okay, got it.
So it probably goes another 100 yards up that way.
Got it, okay. Lovely. Just a nice little deer trail.
Yeah. And that's what we use too, so
yeah.
we'll think that's deer good for something, right?
Yeah, well,
but yeah.
Can you envision, I had this conversation with Autumn last night, a system that didn't use deer fences. Like, is there a way to let, I mean, for her it's a matter of convenience because you could let them graze it up to 5 feet, but then all of your apples is like above that and it's harder and harder to harvest. Is that the main concern? That's the main consideration?
Well, I mean, they can, depending on where you're at and the pressure, I mean, deer can not just chew up to 5 feet, they can devastate a new orchard.
Oh, yeah.
They can devastate a new vineyard,
right.
For that matter. So I think there is, if you're willing to accept the fact that, the apples will be, over your head by the time it's mature.
Yeah.
It's not one of those situations that I'm willing to put into play. I mean, it's just like anybody I work with who's planning a new orchard that doesn't have it, we're going to get a deer fence or some sort of deer exclusion device.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm not going to be a part of it because they'll just devastate the trees.
Again, risk management.
Yeah.
No, I get it.
But to that, on the deer fence that's around the orchard, one thing we found in the first couple of years is that the vole population was really high.
Ah, okay.
And what we didn't realize is that the wildlife fencing, as much as it kept deer out, also kept foxes and coyotes and other critters out.
Right.
And so, because as the squares get smaller as you go down the fence,
okay.
And so, and it keeps groundhogs out, which is great, and rabbits to some degree,
right.
But it kept out those predators.
Right.
And so we cut some little squares out, or whatever you want to call them, cat doors.
Oh yeah.
In the fence to allow something small enough to get in and out, and then we coaxed it in with cat food just to kind of get them trained to coming in, and now they know how to get in and out. And
nice.
I really feel like the vole population has dropped quite a bit.
Oh, fantastic!
Yeah,
wow, that's great.
So,
yeah, I was going to ask about that too. Yeah, because for that exact reason. That's great.
I mean, we use tree guards around each of the trees,
right?
For vole protection. But outside of that, there's no really effective vole control except for poisoning them.
Right.
And we're just not going to go down that alley.
Yeah.
Even people who use high doses, there's a vitamin D product that's out there, which is lethal to animals if they eat enough of it. I'm just like,
right.
It's not a direction I want to go.
Right.
So I'd rather try and exclude them as opposed to and let other critters eat them.
Yeah.
So
great.
Yeah. But
should we head this way, or which way? Back towards the road, maybe.
Well, let's go down this way because we can get a little bit closer and.
Oh yeah. Immersive was the word I was looking for the experience of being here. And it's immersive to all parts of you. Where I think vineyards and orchards feel segmented, and there's, I don't know, it's not immersive unless you have an old orchard. That's where I think you finally get to that, where you have the big trees and you have like an understory and you can kind of walk under branches and things like that.
Right.
This is beautiful. Look at that little tumble.
Yeah. Well, after we get our 0.6 of an inch of rain at 4 o'clock, this will be
right.
roaring.
It feels pretty quick, right? It's like,
it doesn't take very long.
Yeah.
And especially now that there's a little bit of moisture in the soil.
So, are you making cider commercially or just on the side? this is you're a farmer is your main job, right?
Farming and consulting. Yep.
Yeah, farming and consulting.
Yeah. Well, the answer is that no, I'm not making it commercially. I've thought about it. Part of me at this point in my life has to consider whether I want the hassle of having a license and record keeping and reporting and taxes and all that kind of stuff. But the other part is like, I mean, as you well know, we live in an area where there are some tremendous cider producers who've been doing it far longer than I have.
Yeah.
And I would have to feel like I'm doing something really special that complements what's going on in the area.
Right.
And isn't just like another cider that somebody's making because it's like a hot new thing.
Right.
And in that way I can do what I want, when I want, but...
So what are some, to get you talking, what are some unusual things that you've learned in the 40 years that you've been farming? Like I just found something out from goat farmers who've been farming for 40 years. That if you have unfixed cats in a goat barn, pregnant goats will abort. And the other person I told this to surmised because it was like the pheromone is a predator pheromone, and it might trigger like this evolved response to like abort your child if there are too many predators in the area, kind of
right
thing. And so now this goat farmer where we were only allows fixed cats for their barn cats. But that's I don't know, I just thought there was like such a fun, interesting thing that like if you don't talk to somebody who's been at it for a while, you would never know. But it's vitally important because it's a stupid mistake if you never heard that before.
Right, right.
What about that with apples?
That's a good question. And I think that, it's... For all the progress, air quotes again, that we've made in the last 100 years of, tree fruit technology, that all those changes have not always been for the good. And there's... Yeah, I think that, I think what I've really found is that, by and large, and again, your listeners and the people that we've been talking about are not in this, but that we're rather close-minded when it comes to farming and agriculture, growing fruit. And it goes in part to this triple bottom line concept of how do we bring these other elements, aesthetics, clean air, clean water, into the conversation, if not to the financial bottom line. I think we sometimes dismiss new ideas and new concepts simply because they just don't seem reasonable because we've let them go. But John Kemp with AEA, Michael Phillips, a bunch of people who are associated with Acres USA, many of the authors there, Michael Phillips as well, as if I didn't just say his name, that there was a lot of research in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and we knew a lot of the damage that we were doing agriculturally back. That was the whole reason Rudolf Steiner gave the biodynamic lecture. And we gave that up when, at the end of World War II, we had these powerful tools that would kill anything. The Green Revolution happened and all that kind of stuff. And I think that it entrained us and kind of lured us into this false sense of optimism that, we as a species are going to be able to, work our way out of any situation if we just, come up with a different technology, a different tool or whatever. Instead of thinking about it from a more nature-based standpoint, and looking at it the way that the farmers did 100, 150, 200 years ago, and obviously long before that, when they didn't have those tools. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of good things that have happened in the last 100 years. I think that technology has helped us to better understand some of the biological realities with disease life cycles, insect life cycles, that kind of stuff. Elaine Ingham couldn't do the work that she did. Michael Phillips couldn't have written the books that he did. John Kemp couldn't be doing the work that he's doing without a lot of that progress. But where they differ from, I think, a lot is that they're allowing themselves to be more expansive in their thought process and looking back in time at some of this seminal research that was just put in a box on a shelf because, well, now we had DDT, that kind of stuff. And there's not like a specific thing like, barn cats and goat barns.
Right.
But that I think if we, if we allow ourselves to kind of come back to a more nature-based approach, to be more one in what we're working with and around us and the people we're working with, the intentionality of what we're doing, that a lot of the so-called problems that we have, answers will be revealed. Either with plant teas or compost. It doesn't mean there's just sort of magically the poof on the landscape or whatever, but I think if we try new things and be more expansive in our research, I mean, I can't remember which of your guests it was, that every farmer should be doing research on their farm. That's something very simple that's not being done. Most farmers don't do research on their farms. They've been dependent on Cornell and Penn State and Michigan State and UC Davis to do a lot of that. That's changing because those land-grant university programs the nature of those programs is changing. But if you're like, in a mindset like we are, we're going to be the ones that have to do that research because nobody else is. And whether it's on a very local, regional type of, level, or something broader, is kind of irrelevant. But we, and we can do that through research network collaboratives. I'm also, so Michael Phillips, in addition to all his books and the work that he did, had started this Holistic Orchard Network, which began actually over 30 years ago with the Berkshire Roundtable. It was a meeting up in the Berkshires where holistic growers would get together and kind of muse on all these different concepts. And then in the 2000s, he started the Holistic Orchard Network, which was an online forum for people to ask questions, engage in conversation. Well, when Michael passed, there was nobody right in line to sort of pick up that work and run with it. And so myself and another guy in Vermont, Todd Parlow, with the graciousness of Nancy, Michael's wife, and his daughter Grace, basically gifted us the Holistic Orchard Network to carry it on, in a very general way for the Holistic Orchard Network, regionally, nationally, internationally. We have some international people on there, but also to carry on Michael's legacy, because there is a treasure trove of information in there that if people spend any modicum of time on there, you're going to find stuff, questions asked, answers being given, resources that you're not going to find anywhere. It's just, and so Todd and I have taken this, and he's working on the website part of it. I'm working more on the admin side of all of this. But where I was going with that is that this is still very much an active thing that's going on, the Holistic Orchard Network. And we've toyed around for years with developing at least a small group of growers that are willing to work collaboratively on similar research projects. Could be fire blight, could be codling moth control, could be nutrition, could be sap analysis. And we're going to continue to do that kind of work. So that impetus, or the potential is there. It's just that, the individual growers need to have the impetus and intentionality to want to participate and follow through on that. And some will, and some don't have the time, and that's fine, because we all need to learn from each other. Anyway, I feel like I got sidetracked a little bit, but what I've learned.
I was going to ask you about that anyway, so I'm glad you.
I mean, we're not doing enough of that kind of stuff, and we can't depend on the land grant universities to do the kind of research around the questions that we really desperately need to have asked. Or answered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to walk?
Sure.
You walk up?
We'll just go back up the hill here.
So while we're walking, if you have the breath,
yeah,
I'd love to get your thoughts about pears. And are there any differences in working with pears? I mean, I'm sure the approach is the same, but in terms of anything that you've noticed, both in terms of growing, what they like, or anything else.
Yeah, well, sure. Pears have different pest complex, both disease and insect. Actually, let's walk back over this way. They grow differently and they bear differently.
Uh-huh.
I think the one strong similarity they have to apples is that they are susceptible to fire blight.
Ah.
In fact, that's what wiped out the pear industry in the Hudson Valley.
Oh, wow.
Back in the late 60s.
Sounds like we need some good pear breeding. Are there any varieties of any palm fruit that are fire blight resistant?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, there's
So
quite
it's
a...
possible.
Yeah. Yeah, and in Canada at the Ontario Research Station, they have developed at the Harrow Research Station on the Ontario Peninsula, they have developed a number of varieties that are fire blight resistant. And the same thing down at the USDA ARS station in Carneysville, West Virginia. They came up with like Potomac and Shenandoah.
Oh, nice. Okay.
So yeah, there are fire blight resistant, and they're actually good pear varieties. I think everybody wants to plant these peri-pear varieties, which are like magnets for fire blight. Gotcha. And I don't know if you've talked to Autumn about it, but you know,
she's like, "Are you sure you want to do pears?" It's like, "Oh, I'll listen."
Yeah,
yeah. No,
I mean, Seckles are, while they're not a peri-pear, seem to be, because the skin to flesh ratio is different, have a higher tannic content than larger, say like Bartlett's or Boscs, and so a lot of people will use those to make peris out of. But I think the exciting thing again is going back to what people are finding in nature.
Right. Yeah.
And there's one grove of pear trees, which I'm still not sure whether it's a planted pear orchard or a feral or wild one that sprung up for some reason.
Yeah.
In the Catskills, which is quite impressive.
Oh.
So there are some wild pear varieties out there, or I should say trees that are out there.
Yeah, yeah.
They're not named varieties.
We just encountered a pear. What was the word you just used? A little grove that apparently was all a single tree. Like it was a, what do they call it? A root suckering variety.
Yep.
And we tasted the cider made from it. It was amazing, and it was like, I don't know, like I love the idea again of a whole grove being a single organism. And then it made some really delicious perry. So, and yeah, really. So I was excited by that. I don't know, how it does otherwise, but it's feral. It's been around for a while in a place where it hasn't been sprayed at all. Just a wild grove. So that was kind of exciting. And I just recently learned about. So I knew. With pears, you have sorbitol,
Right.
the unfermentable sugar, which adds like this perception of sweetness or a sweetness to the cider, even when it's fully dry. And then there are apples like that as well. Do you? So I just found out about the sorbitol apples, which was kind of interesting as well.
Well, I have to say I don't know about that.
Oh, okay. They might be more cider.
They could be, yeah.
Cider varieties.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I make cider, I am certainly not
right.
fermentation
Got it.
expert. But I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah.
Kind of off topic, but on the drive over here, I was talking about silvopasture, agroforestry and with animals, and no sooner had I talked about like these. We were just talking about maybe you don't need a big barn even in this environment if you have like a grove of trees that animals can shelter in. Especially certain breeds are really hardy even in the cold winters here. And no sooner had we said that than we passed a field where there's one tree and every cow in the field was under the tree. It's like, why don't farmers see that and take note? And say like, oh, maybe we should add a few more trees in here. They seem to like them.
That's because if they left trees in there, that's one less cow they can put out there, Right. We'll head over this way.
I mean, it reminds me of a lot of stuff in, just observational farming, like that you were talking about. Actually paying attention to what's already really obvious.
Well, I mean, that goes back kind of to Fukuoka, thing of where if you've read One Straw Revolution, he talks about finding these huts on the hills after he went back to the family farm, where the farmers would go and they would rest or have lunch. He found haiku was written on the walls and stuff, but it was like and it's speaking very generally again, we don't take time out of the active part of farming to engage in what's going on around us. And whether we keep notes or write haiku or whatever is, that's up to the individual. But, there should be like a little meditation spot in every orchard where you just sit and you're one with what's going on.
Yeah.
And you'll see some of that stuff. And sometimes you don't even have to meditate. I mean, it's like driving past the field with the cows under the tree. It's just like, duh.
Right.
They need shelter.
This massive field of grass, and it was like probably a 10, 15, 20 acre field of grass and one tree.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what you're talking about, I don't know if you listened to the episode with Virginia Samsel, but she calls that non-transactional time with your plants.
Right.
Spend non-transactional time on your farm, essentially. She's like, take a nap.
Yeah, I did listen to that one.
Yeah.
It was very fascinating because that's exactly what we need to be doing.
Yeah.
Everything's grown up. I don't.
Right.
I mean, I know where I'm going, but it's just wandering a little bit more than I might normally.
Oh, here comes some rain. You I don't know. Anything else that you're thinking about that might be out there? Might just be a question for you right now. Might not be. Like, what are the questions you'd like to see asked that aren't being asked?
I mean, I guess I'd like, and this goes again to this integration of esoteric and secular science. I'd like to see some real research done on plant communication and energetics.
Yeah.
Beyond a handful of researchers like Monica and Stefano. There's this whole concept, of quorum sensing and down in the root, and because I think those are going to lead us in a direction that we desperately need to go in, and I think it will expand our capabilities as stewards to nurture the plants in the land in a way that brings us to that Fukuoka level of, don't do nothing, but do as little as possible and write haiku,
Yeah.
And I mean, some of that is, I'm not saying it needs to be data driven, but I think it needs to go beyond just kind of plain rhetoric.
Yeah.
And to some degree, that's what we've got. And, but I think there's, Goethe, was very much in sort of an observational state of mind. Too bad the plastic's not up on the greenhouse.
This is like the perfect level of rain, actually.
Yeah.
Refreshing, but not drenching.
Well, at 4, it's supposed to come down in buckets, so.
Okay.
Yeah. So, all right. So this whole area is going to become kind of a work zone.
Okay.
We're going to dump wood chips here. Compost is going to be moved over here. All of this brush, we're going to do a biochar pit, and we're going to make biochar. So I think there's also needs to be more research into. There's already enough research into why biochar is important or how it can be important to agriculture. So I don't even know that that's a question. It's like, how do we get it into the hands of people and using it on a larger scale to the point where it's not just something that, people talk about.
Yeah.
in the regenerative ag circles.
Right.
I still think there's a lot to be done with making good compost.
Yeah.
So apart from the other stuff I was just talking about,
Yeah.
it's like I think we still have some real practical questions that need to be answered around just some basic stuff that we're doing. Soil management, plant teas. Compost making, biochar.
Yeah.
Gene priming is a big one in plants, where they have those genes in the plants to do certain things, whether it's drought resistance or whatever. We need to figure out how to activate them. There's a paper that came out that talked about how cytokinins and even silica, so two separate things, but they both have to do with helping to reduce abiotic stress in plants.
Okay.
So cytokinins can help with drought resistance.
Okay.
Many different types of mycorrhizal fungi can help with drought resistance, as well as well-known things such as nutrient mobility, etc. But silica also can help with drought resistance and drought tolerance.
Interesting.
And yet silica, even though whatever it is, 75% of the Earth's crust is made up of silica, is considered to be a non-essential nutrient. And it's because 75% of the Earth's crust. So how do we in a way that's more than just throwing more silica into the system, how do we get silica in there in a meaningful way that allows for these changes to be made, within the plant in terms of abiotic stresses? And for me, we're using horsetail tea with every single spray that we put on.
Yeah.
And horsetail is about 40% silica.
Oh, okay.
And it works with cell structure, tissue integrity. It has disease resistance capabilities, and also helps, reduce these abiotic stresses.
Could you use diatomaceous earth as a silica source?
Sure, you could.
Stir a little bit of that into a prep?
You could.
Okay.
Yeah. You would probably want to break it down to smaller particles if you wanted to spray it.
Right.
And that's the nice thing about the horsetail is we're actually making an extractive tea.
Okay.
With it and then being able to spray it out.
Okay.
But the other thing I found out, and I didn't realize it, is that bamboo, and in fact all very erect grasses, are the only reason that they're that erect is because of silica.
Oh, interesting.
And so putting, cutting down the grass and using it as a mulch around the trees allows the silica to get into the soil. Not that the earth needs more of it, but hopefully it's a bioactive.
Right.
Bioavailable
version.
Bioavailable version, right.
That's great. You made me think of something when you were talking about goats. I forget what you said right before that. But this has been lovely.
Yeah.
If I remember, I'll say something, but I can't remember now.
Yeah.
But this has been lovely. Look at this. It's rain. We're going to have a rainbow here at the end of this walk,
I think so.
Got sun and rain and
a nice little rain, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we certainly could use more of it. We haven't had enough, and I'm hoping, just keeps on coming.
Kind of had a spring from hell in a way, right? Like sort of droughty and freezy and...
It was very hot in April, and then it cooled off and was rainy in May until it got hot and dry, and then we had the freeze. And then it cooled off a little bit more, and now we're kind of settling into what it should have been all along.
Right.
So.
That's great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks
Thank you.
This is lovely. I hope. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And if you would like to support this podcast and the kind of out-of-the-box thinking about how to build a different agriculture, wine culture, around ecological principles, please consider supporting by subscribing to our Patreon. The link will be in the show notes and on organicwinepodcast.com. Also, Reviews are greatly appreciated, especially positive ones with 5 stars and a nice word. And just spread the word and help let others find out about this podcast. Thank you so much for your support.